Hello, and welcome to this online event about magic, science, and religion in early modern Europe. My name is Rachel Blayfetter, and I'm an editor at Cambridge University Press. I would now like to introduce our speakers. Professor Mark Wadow is an associate professor at Michigan State University and author of Magic, Science, and Religion in Early Modern Europe. Mark explores the rich and complex ways that pre-modern people made sense of their world, from the recovery of ancient ritual magic at the height of the Renaissance to the ignominious demise of alchemy at the dawn of the Enlightenment. Professor Allison Cavey is a professor at the City University of New York with research interests including Renaissance and early modern history of natural philosophy, history of medicine, and the history of gender and sexuality. I will now hand over to Mark and Allison.
I know this is a set of interests that you've really had percolating in your mind for so long, and I wanted to ask you how this book has changed from the one you originally envisioned to be this wonderful book that we have now.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And thanks to everyone for joining us. This is really cool. So yeah, when I was first approached by Cambridge University Press and asked to write a course book, a book intended to be used in the classroom, pitched at the undergraduate level, but also can be used and hopefully enjoyed by anybody who's not an expert in this already. The first real challenge and my first approach to it was I'm trying to cover 350 years of history and in one book. And how do I do that? How do I cover so much history? And what exactly are the main historical beats or moments that I want my audience to come away understanding? And that's, I think, a really pedagogically oriented or classroom oriented way of thinking about how do we present content. Thinking about that question, what is it that I want my audience to take away ultimately? And so that's how the book began, was puzzling through that. How do I structure this? How do I, what are the things that I need to put in here? And what are the things that maybe aren't going to make it into a book that covers so much content? Over the course of writing the book, and I used a sort of early draft in one of my own classes to get student feedback. Over the course of that, the book changed for me away from just what content am I trying to pass along. Instead, I'm thinking more about how can I show and persuade my audience that we really aren't all that different from the people that I'm describing and talking about in this book. People who lived hundreds of years ago, when we talk about the history of ideas, the history of religion or science or magic, there's a real strong sense, I think, as a modern person, oh, we're so different from those people. The worlds that we occupy are so completely different, and our understanding is also really different. And so what I wanted to do with the book was really show my audience, no, and make a case for the fact that, no, actually, we're really very similar, right? We inhabit worlds that are actually, if you just scratch the surface a little bit, almost identical. And we still wrestle with questions like, what explains the things going on around us? How can I, as a person, make sense of the inexplicable, right? And those aren't questions that have gone away by any means. And so it became, for me, over the course of writing it, more of a real effort to just show people our sort of common shared human experience that transcends time and context and culture and language. And so that ended up becoming a really important part of the book that was kind of another layer on top of or beneath the actual content itself.
I'm obviously interested in these questions in my own work, so I wanted to ask you to think a little bit more about, or to talk a little bit more about how these systems that we come up with as humans, as civilizations, to make sense of the inexplicable or the things that escape our current systems, how those very human efforts to make sense of the world really do look similar, and and in some ways different between the early modern and the modern period. And I wonder if you would speak specifically for my own interests. I'm obviously interested in belief as a very powerful thing. And I think it's the belief in that is a modern thing, that we believe in something, whereas I think belief itself had more power in perhaps the late medieval and early like up through 1550. So I'm wondering if that's a question that you have answered in any way for yourself as you were working through this.
That's a good question. It's also a really big question. Yeah, I think one of, writing a book like this where approaching this through three different lenses in some ways, talking about magic, talking about religion, talking about science or natural philosophy as it was called then, gave me a way to, I think, kind of address that, right? That pre-modern people had a lot of overlapping systems and institutions that all combined to create this worldview. And that's not to say that that worldview was universal across everybody. People who were educated saw the world differently than people who were not. People who had more hands-on experience with certain crafts or certain trades had a much different way of understanding the world than someone who didn't, right? So, and those things, that remains true today as well. I think when it comes to belief, and this gets maybe back to the classroom a little bit, I think this might answer your question. If not, I'll try and you turn back towards it. But one of the things that my students struggle with is, how do we understand or even respect ideas in the past that we now think of as wrong, that we now think of as, well, people just were ignorant, they were wrong. And as someone who studies pre-modern science and medicine, I want to kind of get my students thinking beyond these simplistic ways of, well, this is right and wrong, that these beliefs were correct or not correct. And so one of the things I often do in my classes is I ask my students how many of them believe that the Earth is moving right now. And they all put their hands up. I think hopefully they all put their hands up. And then I say, great, well, show me proof of that. And they can't, right? They go down, they say, oh, well, there are satellites. I say, great, pull up a satellite feed for me. No, you can't? Okay, well, can you point outside the window and show me proof, empirical evidence that the Earth is moving? No, okay. So why do you believe the Earth is moving? And they finally come down to, well, because someone told me. Someone told me that the Earth moved, someone that I trusted, a parent, a teacher. And in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, right? I mean, our daily experience is that the Earth is not moving. It doesn't feel like it's moving. We don't see birds taking off and then, right, flying backwards as the Earth spins. And so that really helps them conceptualize how and why people in the past believed the things that they believed, right? It wasn't that they were ignorant, it wasn't that they were wrong. It's that they were told certain things by people that they trusted. And that allows my students, I think, to get a much broader conception of what belief is and how it still functions, even in the thing we call modern science. And I think you're right to point out that this modern idea of a belief in something, we also have inherited in the modern world. We took these institutions and these realms like religion and science and magic, and they were broken apart, right? People built really big walls between those things and said, this is over here, and now this is over there. And we, in some sense, lost the ability to construct a belief or an understanding in the world that can partake of all of these different things simultaneously. We can still do that, and many people do, but it comes now with all kinds of psychological and philosophical obstacles, right? Especially when it comes to things like science and religion. So yeah, I think the beliefs we have are a little bit different today, and the boundaries we've placed between things are certainly different than they were in the pre-modern period. At the end of the day, though, we're all inhabiting a world full of events and phenomena that we can't necessarily explain. We end up trusting the authority, the credibility, the word of certain individuals or certain institutions. That certainly hasn't changed in 400 years or 2,000 years or 10,000 years.
Yeah, certainly one of the things I enjoyed about your book was your very deft handling of the idea of authoritative knowledge. So the ways in which knowledge was perpetuated and supported and new knowledge was introduced, I thought you did such a great job of getting us as readers to understand those primary sources and really bring us into the way the primary sources dealt with things that they were trying to prove or to demonstrate to be true and to encourage people's belief in some things that didn't seem very believable. So I wanted to ask you about your primary source material. Was there anything that surprised you? I mean, these are sources you've been working with for such a long time, but I always find something that surprises me every day, I think. So maybe you could share with us some of the best surprises you found, or some devastatingly bad ones, I guess.
Yeah, so the primary sources, the actual historical sources, are the things, of course, that for historians, they're the core of everything that we're doing. This is where people actually recorded the ideas that were in their heads. And this is how we come to know them best. And so, I mean, so there's a couple things. One that really strikes me is John Dee. So Dee was an English mathematician and astronomer. He was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. He was a very highly educated, very religious person. And Dee, along with lots of other people, was obsessed with this idea of an ancient and lost wisdom, right, or knowledge that humanity had once received from God. In Christian mythology, thinking of the garden, where Adam and Eve kind of understood things in a particular way because God allowed them to, or granted them, knowledge of the world. After the expulsion from the garden, God took that knowledge away. And for Dee, for lots of other people in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, human history was really an attempt to recover that ancient wisdom. And Dee was obsessed with this idea for his whole life. And in the 1580s, he began to experiment with conversations with angels. So Dee thought, if I want knowledge of the universe, how it was created, how it all fits together, chances are I can't probably talk directly to God. But what if I could talk to something or someone that was there at the very beginning, like one of the angels? And so Dee then spends the next 30 years, roughly, trying to find ways to communicate with angels. And he used a crystal ball. He used mirrors made of stone that was highly reflective. He had his scryers who would look into these things and they would say, "Oh, I see this, mysterious being here." And Dee wrote everything down in his diaries, which have been translated and published many times. And what I find really interesting is Dee was so desperate to reclaim this ancient wisdom. He also understood that whatever he was talking to in that crystal ball, it could be an angel or it could be a demon, right? And demons in Christian mythology are just fallen angels. They were there at the beginning as well. And they have this knowledge of nature and of the universe that surpasses anything humans have. And when I was reading through translations of Dee's diaries and his conversations with angels, it was so interesting to me the ways in which he would continually try to kind of prod and test every being that showed up, right? Who are you exactly? What is your name? What is your relation to other angelic beings? And trying to understand, are you a real angel? Or are you a demon disguised as an angel? And Dee was genuinely frightened of the possibility that he might be tricked and seduced by a demon. And yet he kept going, and he kept doing this for 20 or 25 years in spite of his deep fears. And this was not just a fear of being tricked. Right? Dee, along with almost everybody at the time, believed if he consorted with demons, he was eternally damned. He would go to hell forever. And I found that so compelling and so, in a way, so human, right? That this magician, this sort of Renaissance magician and mathematician, believed so strongly in this notion of an ancient wisdom that he was willing to take any risk. And reading those diaries really brought that home to me and helped me understand Dee as a human being and not just a sort of abstract concept. So yeah, I mean, that to me is just super compelling. And there are places in those diaries where he claims to have sucked out a demon, which is pretty cool.
Well, demonic seduction is in fact one of the prime time terrors of this period of time. So it's interesting to read how people from the period understood demons and their relationship to knowledge in particular, right? I mean, that's always a big issue, particularly in the 16th century and a little bit, I think, in the 17th. So it's after my period, but that people know that demons will offer you whatever they have available and that you want. So to tempt human ambition, which is of course what Dee was really driven by, an ambition to know, but it's ambition nonetheless, is it's understandable and really respectable that he was concerned about this, and that's certainly a great example. We have talked for years about the weapon salve as well, which is this wonderful recipe for a salve that people could use to treat a wound that had been made by a particular weapon by putting the salve on the weapon itself. And I'm wondering if you could just talk us through the wonders of the weapon salve and the debates over whether it worked, because they're some of my favorite moments.
Yeah, so this is right, and so this is a really interesting topic. I love this topic so much. And yeah, this sort of idea of sympathetic healing or healing at a distance. This idea that if someone's been wounded by a weapon or by anything, if I take traces of blood, either from the weapon or just on a piece of cloth, and I apply this substance to it, there's some invisible sympathy, some invisible connection between those two bloods. That's not really the right word, but those two sources of blood. And so whatever I do to one will influence the other. And people came up with this idea. It first appears in the 1580s, around the same time that Dee was talking with angels. And that was also around the time when the study of magnetism was becoming a really big deal. So people were looking at lodestones, natural magnets, attracting pieces of iron without any visible connection between them. So the idea of these invisible correspondences or sympathies made perfect sense. And the weapon salve, when it was first described, had things like animal fat, human fat in it sometimes, obviously human blood, moss or lichen scraped off of a human skull. A lot of them used mummy or mumia, which is pieces of preserved human flesh. Lots of other stuff, powdered worms and all kinds of things. And this was also around the time when the witch hunts were at their height. And this all looked real witchy. This all looked like a lot of devil medicine, right? With these human ingredients. And what was really interesting was, as this idea propagated through kind of 16th and 17th century intellectual culture, lots of people jumped on board and said, yeah, this makes sense, and I can describe it using natural principles. And then other people would come along and say, well, you're just a devil-worshipping sorcerer. And so there were these really fierce debates about this. What is really interesting is around the 1630s, 1640s, this idea of healing over distances suddenly changes to accommodate new ways of thinking about nature. So it went from this ointment with human ingredients in it and these ideas about sympathies and correspondences, and instead people began talking about the powder of sympathy, a chemical remedy that worked by means of atoms or particles moving through the air. And I love that idea because it shows that the idea itself remained constant for almost 100 years, that we can heal over distances, but the means whereby that healing happened evolved and changed according to the kind of overarching changes in natural philosophy at the time. And so people kind of just took this idea, they hollowed it out, they took out everything that was objectionable and unfashionable, and then they put the new fashionable things in and pretended that it was the same thing. And that particular phenomenon to me is really fascinating because it just kind of shows how people were willing to adjust, to deliberately evolve and change some of these ideas to accommodate wider cultural shifts in how people understood nature, even though the idea itself remained pretty much the same.
It's always so interesting how people will package known truths as new knowledge and then take completely new ideas and put them in old packages and say, oh no, it's really the same thing. But if you're reading it carefully, of course, it is not the same thing at all. And it's amazing. I wonder often how that went over. Like, were readers saying, hey, this is not the same thing at all? And did they then have discussions about the material and decide that it was sufficiently the same to be considered using the same logic box? Or was it actually considered to be a false repackaging, but one that became accepted or that we think was accepted because all we have are the remaining texts? We don't have any written objections usually.
True. Yeah. That is really an interesting question, right? And you're right to say that was a very pre-modern endeavor, right? Was the continual recycling and repackaging, and especially after the Renaissance, the kind of reaching into and borrowing from many different philosophies and different traditions simultaneously, putting them all together to create something that they called modern, right? Something new, something exciting. You're right. And then watching how that survived or didn't survive. Yeah.
I find it especially interesting how different knowledge systems, as you just said, are put together in these bizarre ways that, really sort of mid 16th century forward, you start to see Christian Kabbalah and then a Christian person who doesn't really read Hebrew trying to do Jewish Kabbalah, and then putting just loads of Neoplatonic sources in there as well, with no respect for chronology. We would like to say, oh, well, that's a 2nd century CE source, and now you've put in this 15th century source, and we're not sure they're really the same, So it's always fascinating to me. I mean, I just recently had an editor who's a lovely human being, but say, oh, well, it says here Boethius, and don't you want to talk more about that? And I said, no. Because I have no idea which, we think Boethius, oh, well, it must be the Boethius that we read now. But what if it was actually a different Boethius? He never mentions the text again. And I really don't know what reference he's making. So no, I don't want to talk more about it. But I find these sort of almost collages of knowledge systems a fascinating thing from this period.
Yes, and the fact that plagiarism was rampant, right?
Oh, yeah.
That it was not necessary to cite or attribute anything. And so you could borrow, you could steal, you could do whatever you wanted and never acknowledge where it came from, which, as modern people studying the past, makes it sometimes really difficult to figure out which actual text did this come from, which actual author did this come from. So, yeah.
Or sometimes they'll put in a bunch of different names, right? The author that I'm working on is very fond of citing 25 different people in 4 lines. And sometimes he will cite the text, but then if you go back through the list of his libraries, and you're like, but you didn't even own that book. So where did you get the book? Did you really read it, or did someone you know just tell you this? So it's sort of a fascinating way of thinking about knowledge accumulation. We've both, of course, read the books that say that the early modern period was sedimentary knowledge, that it was one layer of knowledge on top of the other without much examination or excavation. And of course, I don't agree with that. But I think one of the things that you did so well in this book was to show us how it's possible to excavate through those layers and come up with a really consistent and elegant argument about how knowledge was produced and transmitted, and how these boundaries that we think of now as impermeable were in fact permeable, not just through discipline of science, of religion, of magic, but also more permeable than we would guess between classes because of the way that knowledge was transmitted. I thought you did that so well.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and that's why I think the history of science and medicine and technology are so important to understanding where we are today, right? I think a lot of people have this idea that sort of modern science was sort of magically invented in, I don't know, 1920, and that everything before that was just abandoned as superstitious nonsense. And in fact, if we can excavate through those layers, which is a nice, I think, a nice analogy, and you find a lot of traces of things that we still believe today, or practices that we still use in science today and in medicine. And they're right there. People were using them in the 15th century. And I think that is just really important for people who want to study and practice science and medicine, who want to engineer technologies, to understand, right, that this is not, we're not doing something that's shiny and new. We are the descendants of a very, very long line of people, very intelligent, very smart, very creative people, who were already thinking some of these things many, many hundreds of years ago, right? And that, I think, gives us a much needed dose of humility as modern people. So,
yeah, I think one of the great privileges of doing the kind of work that we do is that you get this long inheritance. And if you are given the privilege of sorting through it and playing with it and trying to understand it better, what you do get a sense of is an underlying humanness, and a shared commitment over centuries to try to make the world a more predictable, more comprehensible space. And I really think that for me is why historians of science can, for example, look at a eugenics treatise from 1942 and also look at Galton in his first work on eugenics, and then look at the Great Chain of Being from 200 years before Galton and say, oh, look, these three things are really similar, and they may have been built in a direction that is very negative. But in fact, the original iteration was one that allowed people to understand, or to try to understand, the place of human beings in the world compared to God. And so I think that's just such a fascinating thing,
I think so too. And I think one of the things I really tried to do with this book was make the argument that even though we use different words and different terms, and we might have different theories and different kinds of evidence today than people had in the past, we're still asking the same questions, right? We're still asking these big fundamental questions about the nature of reality and where did everything come from? And we still don't have answers to lots of those questions, at least not answers that have convinced everybody. And maybe that's too for any answer, but yeah, I think that, again, that sort of underlying humanness and the sort of shared experience, for me, is one of the reasons why I think studying history is so vital. And that was one of the things that really drove me to want to do this and to try and reach a much wider audience than I otherwise might have with a typical academic monograph.
Which really brings me to the question. I very much enjoyed your first book as well, which was on Jesuit science, and is obviously a very methodical and thoughtful investigation of the ways in which Jesuit practice contributed to Jesuit knowledge production, particularly as it related to natural philosophy and science. And I wanted to know how you think this book speaks to some of the ideas you brought up in that book, and then also goes to new places, and how you found the process of investigating these different sources well outside of the Jesuit knowledge tradition to be both similar to and different from that earlier work.
Yeah, so my first book, which is one of those academic monographs, is called Jesuit Science and the End of Nature's Secrets, and was really, for me, came from this idea of looking at Jesuits working in the 16th and 17th centuries. So these are Catholic priests, and trying to understand, these are men who were trained in very particular ways to conceptualize the unseen, things that they couldn't obviously observe directly, that they couldn't measure directly. And the Jesuits had very particular ways of finding ways to meditate and imagine and visualize all those unseen things. And I wondered, did those same methodologies work their way into the natural philosophy they were producing on questions questions like magnetism being a really big one. Yeah, so that for me was really about making the case that that these endeavors, as we said before, there's no real sort of wall built up between religion and science, right? That for these Jesuits and for everybody else at the time, almost, the two were complementary, that they went hand in hand. That is an idea that I took into the current book as well, in showing that, in fact, it was almost impossible for pre-modern people to conceptualize a world in which studying nature and studying God were not fundamentally linked as a shared endeavor. And you know, one of the ways in which I was able to kind of go a little bit beyond my earlier book was to think beyond just this one small group of individuals that had a very particular way of thinking about nature and how best to study it, and instead to look much more broadly at how lots of different people were bringing to bear different methodologies, different practices, different ideologies, bringing them to bear from one realm to another, right? And so the really fluid interaction between magic and natural philosophy, I think, is a good example of that. And there are historians who have argued, I think, really compellingly, that a lot of the practices and the ideas at the core of a lot of occult and magical philosophies and systems in the 16th and 17th centuries were sort of picked up and moved into the thing we call modern science. That they, in fact, are still there. What was alchemy fundamentally became chemistry, and I think that that's really important. And so, beginning from my first book, where I began to kind of think about some of these issues, this was my chance to really explore this on a much bigger scale, which I found really exciting.
That question that you just raised with your alchemy example of the rise of disciplines is one that, of course, has attracted quite a bit of scholarly attention. And my annoying side was like, but what about the spiritual aspects of alchemy, which were very important in the early modern period, and which, other than Jung, have been largely abandoned in chemistry? I wonder if you can talk us through how these ideas of science and religion and their intersections in the early modern period might help us better understand the disciplines that we have that we call science today, and their relationship with religion even now. I mean, it's often a debate or an opposition, but I think in some cases it doesn't need to be. So maybe you can talk to us about that a bit.
Yeah, so it's a really important topic. It's also, of course, super fraught and problematic in the modern age. We, in some sense, have inherited this from the 18th century, right? From from people who were committed to the idea of separating religion from secular pursuits like philosophy or politics or, you know, lots of other things. And so the separation of church and state is an 18th century invention, right? And that idea is, I think, it's not a bad thing at all. I don't think, but it's created this idea that science and religion they might ask similar questions, but that their ways in approaching these answers are fundamentally and absolutely different, right? And really, there is no room for overlap in their methods for finding answers to those questions. Someone living 300 or 400 years ago would laugh at that idea. They would say, "What are you talking about, right? You want us to understand the nature of everything around us. Well, everything around us started with God, and there are also natural forces at work. Why not study both?" You know, so I think there's lots more to be said, and maybe there'll be questions from the audience about this too. But I think, again, understanding the ways in which these overlapping, in which these sorts of institutions overlapped and really complemented each other and supported each other through a lot of European history, shed some light on how differently we approach this relationship now. So yeah, and I'm happy to talk more about it if that's if people have questions about that. Oh, I think you're still muted.
So we have a question from our audience about the connection between Descartes' evil genius methodological skepticism and the rationalism leading to proof of God, and that God makes rationally incorrigible or metaphysical and moral truths. And it's from Christopher Phillips. I'm wondering if you could talk about this this connection.
Yeah, so Descartes is such a fascinating figure, fascinating and also really frustrating in some ways. And Descartes was fundamentally concerned with the problem of skepticism and doubt and certainty. And he sort of lost himself in a philosophical wormhole of how do I know anything for certain? And he kind of lost his mind and then eventually realized, well, there are things that are universal and that are certain. Mathematics being one of them, and he used mathematics and geometry specifically as his as a touchstone for something that is universally true and certain. But he also believed that God was universally true and certain, and so between those two things, ultimately Descartes devised a philosophy. It was a natural philosophy in that he was describing nature, but it was also a much broader kind of philosophy about just questions about how do we know anything. And he did that by creating or proposing a world in which God operates and created things according to rational and generally mathematical and universal principles, which he called laws. And that we can understand those, right? If you can understand geometry, you can understand the way that the universe works, which is a really compelling idea at a time when lots of people had lots of different and competing theories about how to explain the universe and how anything happens. And so Descartes created a system, and his sort of famous, right, I think, therefore I am phrase was a part of his meditations on first philosophy, right, where it's a really beautiful meditation. I mean, he uses the word meditation in a religious context in part because it is him meditating on the nature of God, but also on the nature of mathematics, the nature of the universe, the nature of himself as a thinking being. And he manages to sort of put all of these things together into one coherent and fairly compelling philosophy. And so, and again, in doing that, Descartes was not unusual. And by that I mean he was not the first person to say we need to find a way to incorporate God, religion, all of these things into the way that we understand the universe. Lots of other people had that same problem. Isaac Newton being one of them, 50, 60 years after Descartes began conceptualizing this stuff. And yeah, Cartesian philosophy is a really good example of trying to create this balance between studying nature and understanding God as part of a single system, and doing so using what he saw as universal rational truths.
I also think if you look a bit earlier, Roger Bacon does this in his use of mathematics as a part. He really sort of determined that mathematics was given to people as part of the knowledge system transmitted by God into the universe, and that people should use it to defend against the impending apocalypse. So I wish they had just come up with chocolate earlier, because I think that if you have chocolate in the world, it is proof that there is a God, and also that you can use it to defend yourself against all sorts of things, as Harry Potter has shown us. But sadly, at this time in Europe, there was no chocolate. It was very sad. So I think that if you look at these knowledge systems and you start to see how they negotiate this relationship, the presence of God in the world and the presence of God in knowledge systems, it's really such a fascinating combination that allowed natural philosophy to emerge as a discipline when it otherwise might not have.
Very true. Very true. Yeah, so I have a question here. Can you say anything about the parallel moral development in the early modern period towards a positive or voluntarist versus natural law versus rational institutionalist versus empirical sentimentalism? There's a lot of verses there, but that is a good question. Oh my gosh, what can I say off the cuff in the time we have left? Yeah, so I think this is actually a good question. I think this sort of idea about the source of morality, right, and ethics that begins to emerge, I would say really, so it really becomes a really important debate in the 18th century. In the Enlightenment, we had a lot of people thinking about this question. Is human morality, is it sort of innately, is it natural? Is it a sort of natural state? Is it something that's created by institutions like education? Is it something that we derive from just studying the world around us? So that was a really big and important argument in the 18th century, but we do begin to see it, I think, emerge in the 17th century. Someone like Robert Boyle he wrote a treatise on moral theology, I think, or moral philosophy, I should say. And Boyle himself was really interested in this idea of, can we connect ideas about morality and ethics and what it is to live a good life and be a good person? Can we connect those things with how we study nature, what we see out there around us? And Boyle had these ideas that maybe through studying nature, we come to better understand God, and through better understanding God, we come to better understand the sort of moral precepts that God has laid out for individuals. And this is a sort of touchstone of what's called natural theology. And again, that became a really big deal in the 19th century. So, but I would say that yes, a lot of these things begin to really take shape in the 17th century as a kind of separate but connected set of questions surrounding natural philosophy, theology, but now also moral philosophy. Yeah. And I'm sorry if that wasn't the best answer possible. It is a really great question. Yeah, so feel free to ask other questions if you wanted to clarify anything about that.
In terms of that sort of consistent debate or continuing debate maybe between or among philosophy, theology, and I would add cosmology in there. How do you think, let me see if I can phrase this well. The 17th century has often been determined to be this moment where the scales tip a little bit in one direction that we've been following ever since. And do you think that that chronology is correct given the work you've done, or is the later date of the 18th century perhaps more accurate, or should we go earlier in the way that we think about these things?
I don't know. Can you say a bit more about that chronology, sort of beginning in the 17th century?
Sure. So, I mean, I think because I, of course, work at just that bit earlier. So I think 1660 or say 1640 is often where you start to see the proliferation of natural philosophy as a consistent, methodologically determined investigation of the natural world that is sometimes and then increasingly often separate from theology. And you also start to see the professionalization of natural philosophy. Still a gentlemanly pursuit, of course, still obviously the purview of elite men, but increasingly one that has rules of engagement, rules of entry. And then we start to have institutions like the Royal Society and the Academy Royale determining what findings are worthy of discussion and also what questions are worth supporting as people ask them. And then by the 18th century, of course, you really see the rise of universities governing particular kinds of knowledge production and supporting those kinds of knowledge production at the expense of others, particularly more 16th century questions that we might look at as dangerous or too big. And then by the 19th century, so I can sort of keep going, but I'm just sort of wondering whether you see that 17th century mark as accurate or whether you think it's maybe more of an 18th century question, or maybe my chronology is just off. I mean, of course, I'm perfectly happy to be set right here.
No, I think so. There are certainly historians who have linked this shift or this division in some sense between religion and natural philosophy, religion and science, to Galileo's encounter with the Catholic Church. Galileo sort of was really clear, too clear maybe, about his idea that theologians should address certain problems and natural philosophers should address others, and that each group should not interfere in the work of the other. That was not an idea that was widely accepted, hence Galileo's trial for heresy and his being found guilty. That was a part of it. In the late 17th century, Isaac Newton is a really good example of someone who believed fervently that inquiry into biblical prophecy and alchemy were essential to understanding the principles of universal gravitation and optics, right? I mean, for him, it really was one endeavor, and to try and separate them was a huge mistake. In the 18th century, we do see some of the Enlightenment thinkers like Diderot, like Voltaire, like others who were really very much concerned about the influence that religion and religious institutions had on public life and public ideas. And that's where we see more of a push, especially in those scientific societies you were talking about, Alison, that in these larger scientific societies in places like London and Paris, the membership became much more restrictive over the 18th century, and it became restricted to what we would call proto-scientists, people who were highly educated in and interested in the investigation of nature. And we didn't find really theologians, priests, sort of, or even physicians, even other kind of people that had been on the peripheries of that culture. We don't find them so much in those major societies in the 18th century. Where we find them are in the peripheral or satellite societies that begin to spring up all over England and France and Germany and lots of other places, where your local curate or priest or your local doctor were involved in scientific work still, which I think is kind of interesting and shows a change in these ideas about who should be asking these questions and in what context, right? It became less permissible to have those individuals involved in these debates in these major societies and the so-called big ones, but in these smaller satellite societies, their presence was still considered perfectly acceptable, right? And yeah, so I think I don't see the 17th century as a time when the scales really began to shift. I think people were trying, but they didn't. They really didn't succeed in moving that until really the 18th century. I would argue.
And we have an audience question here from Adrian Turner, who asks, at what point in early modern history does an assumption that God exists become redundant? And who or what is the agency?
So did you say 17th century?
I would have said, for that one, I'd have said 19th century, maybe early 20th.
Yeah, so I would actually say, we keep talking about the 18th century. I would say the rise of deism as a sort of religious movement / philosophy in the 18th century is really important. Deism was the idea that we believe that God exists, and we're just going to leave it at that.
What about Quakers?
So Quakers are, Quakers and others, evangelical Protestants who begin to appear in the sort of 19th century, groups that are really founded on this notion of truth through revelation, whether that's individual revelation, as in the case of Quakers, or the sort of biblical revelation, which a lot of evangelical Protestants really emphasize. Those groups are really peripheral until the 20th century. Well, Quakers, of course, have been peripheral forever. Sorry, Quakers.
The Quakers were just madly happy to be like part of the shaker, digger, leveler Quaker crowd of the English Revolution. Thank you.
Yes, and they were seen by mainstream Protestants in places like England as being really problematic, right? People who claimed direct access to divine revelation. A lot of mainstream Protestants said we don't care for that, which is why many of those people ended up emigrating to places like the colonies here in the U.S. Or what became the U.S. But deism as a movement became really influential in the 18th century, and this was the idea that God exists, and we're going to all accept that, and we will still keep going to church, we'll still keep believing that God exists. But when it comes to questions about nature or science, we don't need to ask any more questions about God, right? We'll just leave God over here, and that's all we need. And we will instead focus on the manifestations and the phenomena that we can actually observe and measure around us. And that was a really big shift for, at least in the kind of European mindset, and became really popular by the middle of the 18th century.
And we do have one more question. It's a really terrific questions from our audience today. Would you be able to speak about the development of ideas about knowledge, science, religion, etc. in non-Western societies during the early modern period? I know this is one of the things we're supposed to be able to do, but it's always a challenge, eh?
It is a really big challenge. I'm afraid my own expertise on that is very limited. And that's, unfortunately, that has to do with a lot of the way in which academic expertise is sort of siloed. I will say that certainly in the Middle Ages, the European Middle Ages, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century, a lot of information was exchanged between Europe and the Arabic world. And that was really, really important. And I talk about that in my book a little bit, about how that exchange of information, how Islamic and Arabic thinkers took the works of Greek and Roman antiquity, made them their own, built an amazing golden age in the Arabic world in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, and then how that information made its way, how that influenced the development of the Renaissance in Western Europe. So there's certainly that that exchange is super important and continued after that, right? So as the sort of political and cultural encounter between Western Europe and the Ottoman Empire, I mean, that became super problematic, and exchange of ideas became really curtailed. I can't speak a lot to what was happening in the Far East or on the African continent. I know that certainly in places like Japan and China and Goa, there was a lot of stuff. Jesuits as well as other Europeans were going to those places, and there was a lot of scientific exchange going on there, which was super important and really helped both parties, right? It sort of created progress on both sides. And there have been historians lately who have been talking and researching a lot more about the knowledge held by indigenous peoples in places like the Americas and in parts of Africa. I'm afraid I know very little about that because there just isn't much yet, I think, that we know about that. It's so difficult for that knowledge to have been written down and passed on and survived to the present day.
Just on the Asian front, a colleague of mine has recently published with Cambridge University Press, our very host for this panel, a book on soju, which is the art of distillation in early modern Asia. And her name is Hyun-hee Park. And so that's a book that is available. And again, from Cambridge University Press, came out in 2020. So if that is something that interests you, I would encourage you to think about it. She and I have had some really interesting discussions about how soju looks in some ways like early modern European alchemy, but which is its own art and its own set of knowledge. And so I think we often look at the Middle East as a sort of bridge, obviously because of the Silk Road, right, between Asia and Europe. And she and I have really talked about how best to think about that, and whether maybe there's a future collaboration for the two of us in thinking about that knowledge exchange. It's something that really interests both of us. So anyway, we are just about out of time, and I really want to thank you, Mark, for taking the time to talk to me today and to everybody here. This is such a great book, and I obviously I wish you the very best as you go on to publicize it more and get lots of people interested in it. It couldn't be a better or more fun book for any audience to read.
Thank you very much. And I also just want to apologize to those people whose questions I did not get to. You're welcome to contact me if you'd like to. My email address is out there somewhere, so please feel free